even smell like her," he whispered, wrapping his arms around me as if I might disappear. His voice trembled, and my body went cold. I didn't know who she was until I saw the photos. I met Alex at a charity gala. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying, with a quiet confidence that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He was 59, a successful businessman, and though the age difference between us was striking, it felt irrelevant in the moment. His eyes, filled with both sorrow and mystery, captivated me. That evening, we talked for hours. He told me about his late wife, Sarah. "She was my everything," he said, his voice breaking ever so slightly. "3 years ago, I lost her, and honestly, I never thought I'd recover." His words carried an authenticity that made me feel for him, though I barely knew him. There was something disarming about the way he looked at me, like I mattered, like I was filling a void. The first few weeks of seeing Alex were like a dream. He was attentive, generous, and utterly charming. He showered me with thoughtful gifts, jewelry, a designer coat, even a perfume he said would suit me perfectly. I thought I was falling for him. But there were moments, fleeting but strange, that I couldn't ignore. "You have the same laugh," he told me once, out of nowhere. "And your eyes, they're identical." I laughed it off, thinking he was just romanticizing me. Maybe it was his way of processing grief. But his comments became more frequent, more specific. One night, he invited me over for dinner at his place. His home was immaculate, a blend of modern luxury and old-world charm. As I waited for him to finish in the kitchen, I wandered into the living room. That's when I saw it, a leather-bound photo album sitting on the coffee table. Curiosity got the better of me. The first photo made my breath catch. A woman stared back at me, her face so eerily similar to mine that I had to blink to convince myself it wasn't my reflection. Same dark hair, same almond-shaped eyes, even the same subtle smile. It was unsettling. "That's Sarah," Alex said, suddenly standing behind me. I flinched, slamming the album shut. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," he interrupted, his tone soft. "You remind me of her sometimes. That's all." I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't just the resemblance. It was the way he said it, like he wasn't talking to me at all, but to a ghost. Later that evening, as we sat by the fire, Alex leaned closer. "You've brought light back into my life," he said, taking my hand. "For the first time in years, I feel alive again." It should have been sweet, but something about the way he held my hand felt off. Too tight. Too deliberate. I couldn't shake the unease. The next day, I decided to confront him, but the words caught in my throat every time I tried. What could I even say? "Hey, do you like me? Or are you just using me as a stand-in for your dead wife?" It sounded ridiculous, even in my head. But as the days passed, his behavior became harder to ignore. He started mentioning Sarah more often, slipping her name into conversations as if it were normal. "She loved this restaurant," he said over dinner one night. "I think you'd have gotten along with her." It was little things like that, always said casually, as though he didn't realize how unnerving it was. I tried to rationalize it. He was grieving, and grief does strange things to people. But deep down, I knew this was more than grief. Then came the gifts. At first, they were thoughtful and generic, perfume, jewelry. But soon, they took on a different tone. One evening, he handed me a box wrapped in velvet. Inside was a delicate bracelet. "It was Sarah's favorite," he said, fastening it around my wrist. I wanted to rip it off, but I didn't. I didn't want to seem insensitive. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying every interaction we'd had. The way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me, it wasn't me he was seeing. It was her. The breaking point came a week later. He invited me over for dinner again, and I noticed something different the moment I stepped inside. The house was filled with lilies, their overpowering scent making my head spin. "Sarah loved these flowers," he said, smiling. I stared at him, my mouth dry. "Alex, this is starting to feel strange." He looked at me, genuinely puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Everything," I said, gesturing around the room. "The flowers, the bracelet, the way you talk about her. I feel like I'm—" "Like you're what?" he interrupted, his voice sharp. "Like I'm replacing her," I finished, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped closer, his expression softening. "You're not replacing her," he said, cupping my face in his hands. "You're helping me heal." The words were meant to reassure me, but they didn't. They felt heavy, suffocating, like a weight I hadn't agreed to carry. And yet, I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the hope that I was wrong, that there was something real between us. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, as if a shadow from the previous evening still lingered in the room. Alex had already left for work, leaving a note on the bedside table. "You looked beautiful last night. I'll see you tonight, my Sarah." The name jolted me, even though I tried to convince myself it was just a mistake, a slip of the tongue, or a habit he hadn't let go of. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I spent the day trying to distract myself, but his words echoed in my head, weaving together with every strange moment I'd experienced with him. The bracelet, the photos, the way he looked at me as if I were someone else entirely, it all began to feel like pieces of a larger puzzle I wasn't ready to solve. By the time Alex returned that evening, I had almost talked myself into believing everything was fine. Maybe grief made people act strangely. Maybe I was overthinking. But when he walked in, holding a small velvet box, the uneasy feeling surged back. "I got you something," he said, his smile soft, almost tender. He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring with a tiny, vintage diamond. I stared at it, my chest tightening. "Alex, it's beautiful, but It was Sarah's," he interrupted, his tone matter of fact. "She wore it every day. It belongs with you now." I froze, unsure how to respond. His gaze bore into me, expectant yet calm, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. I don't know if I can accept this," I finally said, my voice faltering. "Why not?" He stepped closer, taking my hand and placing the ring in my palm. "You're special to me, just like she was. You're bringing something back into my life that I thought I'd lost forever. This ring, it's a symbol of that." I wanted to pull away, to tell him how wrong this felt. But his eyes held mine, filled with such raw emotion that I couldn't bring myself to reject him outright. "Try it on," he urged gently. I slipped the ring onto my finger, my stomach twisting into knots. It fit perfectly, but instead of feeling cherished, I felt trapped. "It's beautiful," I murmured, forcing a smile. Alex's face lit up. "It's perfect on you. Just like I knew it would be." Dinner that night was quiet, but the silence between us was heavy. He had prepared Sarah's favorite dish, something he had mentioned in passing before. "She loved this," he said, watching me closely as I took a hesitant bite. "I think you'll love it too." I nodded, trying to keep the conversation light, but the walls of the room seemed to close in on me. Every detail, the flowers on the table, the faint music playing in the background, even the way he poured my wine, felt rehearsed, as if I were stepping into a scene he had played out countless times before. "Alex," I began cautiously, setting down my fork. "Do you talk about Sarah like this with everyone?" He blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you bring her up a lot. It's fine, of course, but sometimes it feels like..." I hesitated, unsure if I could finish the sentence. "Like what?" His tone shifted, a trace of defensiveness creeping in. "Like you're still living in the past," I said softly. "And I'm not sure where I fit into that." He leaned back in his chair, studying me. For a moment, I thought I had crossed a line, but then he sighed, his expression softening. "Sarah will always be a part of me," he said. "But you're helping me move forward. I haven't felt this alive in years, and that's because of you." His words were meant to reassure me, but they only deepened my unease. Later that night, as I prepared for bed, Alex knocked on the door and entered holding a small jewelry box. "I want to give you one more thing," he said, sitting beside me. "Alex, I really don't need." "Please," he cut me off gently. "Just open it." Inside was a delicate gold necklace with a single pearl pendant. "It was Sarah's favorite," he said, smiling wistfully. "She used to say it brought her good luck." I stared at the necklace, my heart pounding. I didn't want to accept it. I didn't want to become her shadow. But he was watching me with such hope, such longing, that I felt cornered. Slowly, I picked up the necklace and fastened it around my neck. "Beautiful," Alex said, his voice almost a whisper. I looked at myself in the mirror, the weight of the necklace heavy around my throat. For the first time, I realized what this really was, not a gift, but a chain, binding me to a version of someone I could never truly be. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, replaying every moment of the past few days in my mind. The ring, the dinner, the necklace, it all felt like pieces of a story that didn't belong to me. At some point, I got out of bed and wandered into the living room, where the photo album still sat on the coffee table. My hands trembled as I opened it again, flipping through the pages. Sarah's face stared back at me, page after page. Her laugh, her smile, the way she held Alex's hand, it was all there, preserved in perfect detail. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A note tucked into the back of the album, written in Alex's neat handwriting. If I lose her, I'll find someone who can bring her back to me. Someone who can make me whole again. My blood ran cold. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps behind me made me jump. Couldn't sleep? Alex's voice was calm, almost amused. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his arms crossed. I just couldn't stop thinking, I said, quickly shutting the album. He smiled, stepping closer. That's because you're meant to be here. With me. You feel it too, don't you? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I'll see you in the morning, he said, his tone gentle but firm. And don't worry. Everything will fall into place soon. As he left the room, I felt the walls closing in around me. The trap was already set. I just didn't know how to escape it yet. You're even better than her, Alex whispered, holding my hand so firmly that I couldn't pull away. With you, I can start over. His words hit me like a thunderbolt. Start over? The weight of that phrase lingered in the air, suffocating me. I forced a smile, nodding slightly, but inside, my thoughts were spiraling. I had to ask. I couldn't keep dancing around it any longer. Alex, I began cautiously, my voice trembling. Why do you talk about Sarah so much? Do you see me as her? His lips curved into a small, enigmatic smile. You remind me of her, yes. But that's not a bad thing, is it? She was extraordinary. And so are you. The answer was evasive, like a cloud obscuring the truth. I tried to press further. But do you see me as my own person? Or am I just? You're not just anything, he cut me off, his tone firm yet unsettling. You're the first person who's made me feel alive again. That's all that matters. That night, I couldn't shake the unease. After dinner, Alex suggested we retire to his study for a drink. I hesitated, but his insistence was impossible to ignore. The room was dimly lit, the smell of aged leather and faint cologne filling the air. On the walls were photos of Sarah, dozens of them. Some were framed, others casually tacked onto a corkboard. She was everywhere, her smile frozen in time, watching us. She was my universe, Alex said softly, running his hand along a framed portrait on his desk. Every decision I made, every success I achieved, it was all for her. I stood there, frozen, unsure how to respond. The room felt like a shrine, a mausoleum where he kept her alive in every possible way. You understand, don't you? He asked, turning to face me. His eyes were earnest, almost pleading. I think so, I lied, swallowing the lump in my throat. He stepped closer, taking my hand again. You've brought something back into my life that I thought I'd lost forever. You've given me hope. There was something in his gaze, a deep longing that both frightened and captivated me. I pulled my hand away gently, murmuring something about needing to check on the fire in the living room. Back in the living room, I sat on the couch, staring at the flames dancing in the fireplace. My heart raced as I replayed everything he had said, every moment we'd shared. The way he looked at me, the way he spoke to me, it wasn't love. It was obsession. I heard his footsteps behind me, but I didn't turn around. He sat beside me, his presence heavy. You seem distant, he said, his tone low but pointed. I'm just tired, I replied, keeping my voice steady. It's been a long day. He nodded, his gaze never leaving my face. I can understand that. It's not easy to step into someone else's world, especially when it's as complicated as mine. The word complicated felt like an understatement. He leaned back, exhaling deeply. But you're doing so well. Better than I ever imagined. Better than Sarah could have, in some ways. My stomach turned. What do you mean by that? You're more adaptable, he said simply. More open to understanding what I need. I didn't know whether to feel flattered or horrified. His words were so carefully chosen, yet they carried an edge that unsettled me. Later that night, after Alex had gone to bed, I found myself pacing the hallway. I couldn't sleep, not with the weight of everything pressing down on me. My eyes drifted to the study door, slightly ajar, the light from a desk lamp spilling into the hall. I shouldn't have gone in. But I did. The room was even more unnerving in the stillness of night. The photos seemed to glare at me, their smiles mocking. I approached the desk, drawn to a small stack of papers resting on top. At first glance, they appeared to be old letters. But as I read the first one, my breath caught. Sarah, you've always been my world. If I ever lose you, I'll find someone who can bring you back to me. Someone who can complete us again. My hands shook as I flipped through more pages. Each one was more haunting than the last. Notes, journal entries, all speaking of a plan to recreate what he'd lost. It wasn't just grief. It was a fixation, a calculated attempt to replace her. I shoved the papers back into the drawer, my heart pounding. As I turned to leave, I heard the floorboards creak behind me. What are you doing in here? Alex's voice was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it. I spun around, forcing a smile. I couldn't sleep. I thought I'd look for a book. His eyes narrowed, scanning the room. Find anything interesting? No, I said quickly, brushing past him. Just some old papers. I'll head to bed now. But as I walked past, I felt his hand grip my arm. Not hard, but enough to stop me. Don't go through things that aren't yours, he said, his tone icy. I nodded, pulling away and retreating to the bedroom. But even as I climbed into bed, my mind raced with what I'd seen. The next morning, Alex acted as though nothing had happened. He greeted me with his usual warmth, offering coffee and breakfast. But his eyes lingered on me longer than usual, as if he were studying me. I was thinking we could spend the day together, he said over breakfast. Maybe visit a lake house. It's beautiful this time of year. I forced a smile, nodding. That sounds nice. But inside, my thoughts churned. The lake house. Another piece of Sarah's world, another place where I'd be expected to fit into her shadow. As we prepared to leave, Alex handed me a coat. Sarah used to love wearing this when it got chilly, he said, his smile tinged with nostalgia. I think it'll look perfect on you. I took it reluctantly, slipping it on. The fabric felt heavy, like the weight of her memory draped over my shoulders. As we stepped outside, Alex took my hand. This trip will be special, he said, his voice soft but firm. I can feel it. I nodded, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. But as we drove toward the lake, the unease grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was heading into something I might not come back from. The drive to the lake house was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional sound of Alex softly humming a tune I didn't recognize. His hand rested lightly on mine, but I couldn't shake the weight of dread that seemed to fill the car. When we pulled up to the house, I froze. It was beautiful, yes, but there was something unsettling about its pristine condition. The white shutters gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the porch swing swayed gently in the breeze. It felt untouched by time, as though someone had hit pause the moment Sarah left it. This is our place, Alex said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. Sarah always loved it here. I think you will too. I forced a smile, stepping out of the car and onto the gravel path. The air smelled of pine and fresh water, but it did little to calm the growing unease in my chest. Inside, it was like stepping into a photograph. The furniture was impeccably arranged, the shelves lined with books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. A faint, sweet scent lingered in the air, Sarah's perfume, I realized with a jolt. I've kept it just as she liked it, Alex said, his hand on the small of my back as he guided me through the rooms. I wanted to preserve the memories. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. In the living room, he gestured to a photo on the mantel, a candid shot of Sarah sitting on the very couch that now stood before us. She was laughing, her hair cascading over her shoulder in soft waves. She was so full of life, Alex murmured, his fingers grazing the edge of the frame. Then he turned to me, his eyes intense. You remind me of her in so many ways. There it was again. That heavy comparison, the unspoken expectation. I'm not her, Alex, I said softly, unsure if I was trying to convince him or myself. I know, he replied quickly, almost too quickly. But you bring her back to me in ways I didn't think possible. The afternoon passed in a haze of polite conversation and strange smiles. Alex showed me the garden, the boathouse, even the small dock where he said Sarah loved to sit and watch the sunset. Each detail felt like a thread tightening around me, pulling me deeper into a life that wasn't mine. By evening, I was exhausted, mentally, emotionally, physically. But Alex seemed energized, almost euphoric. "This is a new beginning for us," he said over dinner, his voice brimming with hope. "I can feel it." I sipped my wine, trying to find the right words. "Alex, I need to ask you something." He set down his fork, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Of course. Anything. Do you want me? Or are you just trying to bring her back?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Alex didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're more than that. You're giving me something I thought I'd never have again." The way he looked at me made my skin crawl, not with fear, but with the weight of his obsession. I pulled my hand away, standing up from the table. "I think I need some air," I said, my voice trembling. Outside, the air was cool and sharp against my skin. I walked to the edge of the dock, staring out at the dark water. My thoughts raced, tangled with doubts and fears. Was I overreacting? Or was this something darker than I was willing to admit? The sound of footsteps behind me made me tense. "You shouldn't be out here alone," Alex said, his voice gentle but carrying an edge of concern. "It's not safe." I needed to think, I replied, not turning around. He moved closer, his presence looming. "I know this is overwhelming," he said, his tone softening. "But you have to trust me. I only want what's best for us. For us." The words felt like a chain, binding me to a reality I hadn't chosen. That night, Alex suggested we watch an old film in the living room. I agreed, hoping it would bring a sense of normalcy to the day. But as the opening credits rolled, I realized it wasn't just any film, it was one of Sarah's favorites. "She used to cry every time at the ending," Alex said, a wistful smile on his lips. "I wonder if you'll do the same." I stared at the screen, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Every moment, every detail felt orchestrated, as though I were a character in a story he had written long ago. When the film ended, Alex turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You're so much like her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Alex," I began, my voice shaking. "I don't think I can do this." "Do what?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. "This," I gestured around the row. "This life, this comparison. I'm not her. I can't be her." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But then he exhaled slowly, a strange calm washing over him. "You don't have to be her," he said, his smile returning. "You just have to stay." In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of movement. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard the unmistakable creak of floorboards. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding. The house was dark, but a faint light glowed from under the door of the study. I approached quietly, peering through the crack. Alex was inside, sitting at the desk, holding a photograph of Sarah. "I'm doing this for you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I'll make it right. I'll bring us back together." I covered my mouth to stifle a gasp, my mind racing. As I stepped back, the floor creaked beneath me. Alex's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto the door. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice sharp. I didn't wait to find out. I hurried back to the bedroom, climbing into bed and pulling the covers over me. Moments later, the door opened. Alex stood there, silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. "I thought I heard something," he said, his tone unreadable. "I just got up for some water," I lied, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at my chest. He nodded slowly, stepping back into the hallway. "Good night," he said, closing the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, I let out a shaky breath. This wasn't just grief. This was something far more dangerous. And I was trapped in the middle of it. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. I hadn't slept. How could I? Alex's words from the night before echoed in my mind, the weight of them pressing against my chest like an unbearable burden. Sarah would have wanted this, he had said, his voice soft but firm, as though he were stating an unshakable truth. His hand on my face felt heavy, anchoring me to a reality I no longer recognized as my own. I heard him moving downstairs, the clatter of dishes signaling that he was already preparing breakfast. My body felt paralyzed, my thoughts racing. I knew I had to leave, but how? And more importantly, when? By the time I mustered the courage to head downstairs, Alex was waiting for me in the kitchen. He smiled warmly, holding out a steaming cup of coffee. "Good morning, my love," he said, as though nothing had happened. I forced a smile, taking the cup. "Morning." His gaze lingered on me, intense and searching. "I was thinking," he began, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of determination, "we should have a special dinner tonight. A way to celebrate us." I hesitated, my heart pounding. "Alex, I don't think." "It's important to me," he interrupted gently but firmly. "Sarah always believed in marking the meaningful moments. And this," he reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly, "is one of them." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The day passed in a blur of tension. Alex seemed almost euphoric, humming to himself as he prepared for the evening. Meanwhile, I wandered the house, my thoughts clouded by fear and the growing realization that tonight would be my last chance to leave. In the study, I found myself drawn to the desk again. The drawer where I had discovered his notes was locked now, but I didn't need to see them again to know the truth. This wasn't about love. This was about control, about obsession. By the time evening arrived, Alex had transformed the dining room into something out of a romantic fantasy. Candles flickered on the table, their soft glow casting shadows that danced across the walls. A bottle of red wine sat uncorked, and the air was filled with the rich aroma of his cooking. But it wasn't the atmosphere that made my stomach churn. It was the dress hanging over the back of a chair. "I want you to wear this tonight," Alex said, appearing behind me. His hands rested on my shoulders, his thumbs brushing against my neck. It was Sarah's favorite. "I think it will look stunning on you." My throat tightened, and for a moment, I thought I might vomit. "Alex, I don't think." "Please," he said softly, his voice tinged with something desperate. "For me." I swallowed hard, nodding. "Okay." In the bedroom, I slipped into the dress, my hands trembling as I fastened the zipper. It fit perfectly, as though it had been made for me. But when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see myself. I saw Sarah. When I returned to the dining room, Alex's face lit up. "You look perfect," he said, his voice filled with awe. He crossed the room, taking my hands in his. "You don't know how much this means to me," he whispered, pulling me into an embrace. I stood stiffly in his arms, my heart pounding. Dinner was quiet, almost serene. Alex spoke at length about the future he envisioned for us, weekends at the lake house, trips to Paris, growing old together. His words should have been comforting, but instead, they felt suffocating. After dinner, he led me to the living room, where a small record player sat waiting. "Sarah always loved this song," he said, placing the needle on the record. A soft melody filled the room, haunting and bittersweet. He held out his hand. "Dance with me." I hesitated, but his gaze was insistent. Slowly, I placed my hand in his. As we swayed to the music, Alex's grip tightened, pulling me closer. "You've brought me back to life," he murmured, his lips brushing against my ear. I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay calm. But when he whispered, "I love you, Sarah," my eyes flew open, and something inside me snapped. "Stop," I said, pushing him away. He blinked, startled. "What's wrong?" "I'm not her, Alex," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll never be her." His expression darkened, the warmth draining from his eyes. "Don't say that," he said quietly. "It's the truth," I insisted. "You don't love me. You love an idea of her, and I can't, no, I won't live like this." Alex stepped closer, his jaw tight. "You don't understand. We're meant to be together. This is what Sarah would have wanted." "No," I said firmly, backing away. "This is what you want. And I can't do it anymore." I ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I grabbed my bag, stuffing it with whatever I could reach. "Don't do this," Alex shouted from the other side of the door, his fists pounding against the wood. "You can't leave me." I ignored him, my heart racing as I threw open the window. The night air was cold against my skin as I climbed out, dropping onto the soft grass below. I ran, the sound of Alex's voice echoing behind me. "You can't just walk away. You're mine." When I reached the road, I flagged down the first car I saw, a kind-looking man who didn't ask questions as I climbed into the passenger seat. "Please, just drive," I begged. He nodded, pulling away as I glanced back. Alex stood in the driveway, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of the house. I turned away, tears streaming down my face. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the lake house nothing more than a distant memory. For the first time in days, I could breathe. But even as I sat in the quiet of my tiny apartment that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Alex wasn't finished. His words echoed in my mind, "You're mine."